Couple questions, like because I run into a lot of guys that do UGLs that have always tried to send me shit, and I'm like, nah, I'm good. Like I've tried some things, but it's like I'm good. Maybe I'll try a couple of things, and I don't cycle anymore, so I don't. But there are so many of my viewers do. So I guess my question on the UGL side is, what kind of, and obviously this is a case by case scenario depending on how much, how wide it's going, but what is because it's clearly a felony as a Schedule 3. Is that like a C felony, B felony? And what do you tend to see in terms of penalties that are imposed or recommended? And do people tend to get off? And do they go after the little guy that's making, because, kind of like when it comes to busting a drug dealer, they kind of try to go after the little guy to get the bigger guy. Do you see a lot of that? And then what kind of penalties? Is it always federal? Is it state?
Right.
Is it because a lot of times federal and state based upon drug charges is the scope, the land of the scope. Is it international or interstate commerce or whatever it's called? And then how large is the distribution chain and everything? So what kind of scenarios do you run into, and what are the penalties like?
Right. So obviously every individual state has its own laws. And
Sure.
So in almost every state, there's some kind of law that makes steroids criminalized for non-medical purposes. And so those laws apply, as well as the federal law, which applies in every state separate from that. The feds typically, in order for them to take a case, it usually requires some some level of exposure for prison time. So
Okay.
The guy who's got, 10 vials of Deca is never going to be prosecuted. Even if he sells it, he's never going to be prosecuted for the federal charge.
Right.
He may get dumped into the state. And that's what happens for the lower level cases. Sometimes the feds will dump it into state, although there's always exceptions. Many years ago, I had a guy who was a pilot who came back across one of the land borders in Texas with some gear, personal use amount of gear. And he got caught at the land border, and they prosecuted him federally for that amount of fairly low amount. I was able to find a way within the federal law to actually get the case resolved and dismissed without him actually getting a criminal conviction, which was important because he would have lost his job as a commercial pilot. So it would have been the end of his life for a stupid little, jaunt to Mexico and picking up some stuff for some fun kind of thing.
Right.
So, but usually you'll never see a low level federal steroid case. And, the punishments in federal court for steroids are based on the amount of the steroids. So in federal court, the number of units of steroids determines the prison exposure. And the definition of a unit has changed because years ago, prior to 2006, 2007, the unit was defined as 110 cc vial. So a vial of test sip, let's say, was a unit, right? So you have 100 vials, it's 100 units. And for pills, it was 50 pills is 1 unit. So you have 100 units, 100 Anabol tablets, that's 2 units.
Got it.
That was changed. And I was actually one of the experts and consultants who was part of the process. I was called by the National Association of Criminal Defense Lawyers to explain the sort of the realities of how people use steroids to stop an even worse recalculation, which I was able to do. But because there was some talk about removing any cap, so a large amount of anabolic steroids, 10 years or more in prison. So, but the guidelines were changed so that now there's, 1/2 of a cc of liquid is a unit. So that means that 10 cc vial is now 20 units instead of 1 unit. Okay.
Man.
And 1 tablet is a unit. So instead of 50, it's down to 1. So when you do the math, if you've got, let's say, 1,000 vials, let's say you're a trafficker, you've got 1,000 vials and, 10,000 tablets. The difference between pre-2006 and today is night and day, because the more you have, there's a chart, and the more the number of units, the higher the exposure. So typically the exposure caps out at what's called a level 20, and maybe for a person with no prior criminal history, which also makes a huge difference in terms of what your sentence is, right? If you've got prior arrests and convictions, you're looking at a substantially higher potential punishment than if you're, a guy with no prior criminal record at all. But typically you can be looking at 3 to 5 years as a, kind of a maxed out in the guidelines trafficker. And certainly there's more facts that can even increase you in the guidelines. So if you're using premises for the drug trade, that can enhance your exposure. If you're selling to athletes, that enhances your exposure. If you're selling to kids, that enhances your exposure. If you are in leading or managing other people to do things, even, hey, Dylan, go in here, drop these packages off, help me put these labels on. Now you could get a role in the offense or leadership enhancement. So there's all ways that you can bump, the government can bump up where a person falls in the guidelines. My goal in every case is to keep a client out of jail, right? My goal is always, because these are people typically who've never been to prison before. They're law-abiding people otherwise. Many of my clients have families, have kids. They're gainfully employed. Without them, their family would fall apart. So that's always my goal. And so that's in federal court. State courts vary, and the exposures can be different. Typically, if it's a small amount of steroids, in many states, there are now programs where, like diversion programs, where if you follow certain rules and your attorney is good at what he does, he can keep you out of prison. In return, you'll be in like a community service, diversion kind of program. Sometimes it involves drug treatment classes, including group classes, which is interesting because, I've heard from so many clients who, the guy he's shredded, he's meal prepping. He doesn't put anything in his body. He's doing all the right things. He's immaculate in all of his, he's exercising, doing his cardio, and now he's sitting in a room in a circle with people who are like heroin addicts, meth heads, and who are lost their jobs and maybe they're homeless because they were addicted and their lives fell apart. And this guy's like an overachiever, if anything. Right. And he's thinking, what the hell am I here? Well, this is the apple in the orange crate of the Controlled Substances Act. And so, so I do hear that a lot. But that's kind of a broad array of the sorts of cases that I have.